Shiren the Wanderer on the Wii. This is one of the more recent entries in a very long-standing series that's actually pretty obscure for what it is. Even though the series has been going on since the early 90s, it's pretty obscure, and the reason is twofold. First and foremost, while this series has existed since the Super Famicom Game Boy sort of era, and has been on every console since, like even till now, in North America we only got 3 games. We got one on the DS, which was a remake of the original Super Famicom game. We had this one on the Wii, and we got one on the PSP. Number 2, even though it is part of a very large running franchise, it was actually sandwiched in between 2 much better known entries. Because even though it is the largest chunk of this franchise, it's a spin-off and then would later get spun off of. See, the series originally started as a spin-off of Dragon Quest, and would later be spun off from Shiren to Pokemon, of all things. And I'm not entirely certain on this, but I want to say the Final Fantasy Chocobo dungeon games might have been a spin-off as well. Although that might have been a case of Final Fantasy once again playing catch-up with Dragon Quest. I'm actually not 100% certain on that, because I'm not super familiar with these games. Prior to this one, I'd only played 2 roguelikes that were kind of functionally a little bit different, focusing more on character creation than actual dungeon crawling, and I think that's functionally a problem, but this game gets it right. Now the story follows a certain wanderer. You may have heard of him. He's called Shiren, pretty popular guy. He's got a giant series of games, and his talking magical ferret Copa. They're off on adventures, trying to find a mansion filled with super loot and stuff. And while there is plot development as time goes on, really the story is more or less, I don't want to say an afterthought, but it doesn't feel like it's something on the forefront. It's not really so much a pushing factor as it is just a thing that exists in tandem with the gameplay. Because I think with these games, the real focus is in fact the dungeon crawling. And this game does it really well. Now like I said, I'm not super familiar with these games. The only games like this I've played prior were Cladun on the PSP and Legacista on the PS3. And both those games were reliant on designing your own characters, and really that was pretty much the big draw to those games. But this game focuses more on the actual aspects of the dungeon crawl itself. And it starts out even before you begin the game. Because before you even begin the game, you select your difficulty. It's pretty normal for pretty much any game nowadays. But more classic dungeon crawlers and rogue style games, they're pretty hardcore. You play them, you die, you lose everything, you start over. And this game does that as well, sort of. At the start of the game, you can choose to play on normal mode, which is very much, you have 1 life, the moment you die, you start over. You lose everything. And that's definitely a more pure rogue experience. And if you're a long-term fan of these style of games, that's definitely going to appeal to you. If you're not a fan of that sort of thing, or you've never really played one of these before, there's an easy mode, which really makes recording footage for this game actually really nice, because you can actually save on the world map in between dungeons. Which, yes, plural. That's another thing I love about these games. There's multiple dungeons. But back on topic, the fact that there's 2 different types of way to play this game, the more pure traditional experience and the slightly newer, more contemporary gameplay in general sort of experience, means that if you're not really experienced with these sort of games, you can enjoy it just as really any other game, being able to save in between dungeons. And in turn, if you get good at that, you might want to feel more adventurous, try the harder mode, and then maybe progress into other rogue style games. And if you're not particularly good at these, you can still enjoy the game. And the nice thing is, both difficulties feel like you get the full experience. It doesn't feel like there's any amount of the game that is locked behind one difficulty or the other. And that I really have to appreciate. Now the next big thing in any big dungeon crawling rogue style game is the dungeon, or as I alluded to, dungeons. Over the course of the story, there's something like 30 or so dungeons with about a dozen available post-game as special bonus levels. And I find that kind of impressive because, like I said, I'm not super familiar with these series, but the games that I played for the most part had one long continuous dungeon that you could just sort of hop between various checkpoints sometimes if you progress far enough. Here, it feels like there's a much more natural progression. Your very first dungeon's very small, very simple, and they just grow a little bit bigger in terms of depth and overall size of the environments. And that's nice because as you progress, become a higher level, become better equipped, and become a more confident adventurer, the world expands to meet your new skills and still continues to challenge you. And that is fantastic in terms of progression. Whereas other games that I've played, level 1 is basically the same as level 100, the only difference is the way the tiles are arranged and the enemy levels, and that's about it. That's the thing about a lot of those games, is they feel kind of boring after a while, because even though they are randomly generated and there's theoretically unlimited numbers of potential rooms you could visit, even though once you play for a little while you get used to the RNG and you can predict them like the back of your hand, no problem, they get boring. Whereas this game, it felt a lot harder to really kind of get bored with it, simply because it felt like I was progressing towards something bigger. It felt like I was always moving towards a bigger challenge, a bigger dungeon, a bigger boss. And of course there is that story in the background that, again, not great, but at least it's there to progress the better dungeons, so that's there. Basically, the dungeon designs themselves are fantastic. And if you're not familiar with these types of games, let me just go down the basics of it. Essentially, you're dropped into a random map, and your overall goal is to find the stairs to the exit. You go through X number of floors, then you're done. Of course, you'll probably have to fight a boss and stuff. There's random enemies, random items to find, but for the most part, you're just trying to get to the end. But, and here's where things get sort of clever, even though you want to try and get through the end of each dungeon as fast as possible, there's sort of a duality to the actual principles of how you play this game. On one hand, you want to go through the game as fast as possible so that you can progress to the next dungeon and ultimately beat the game. But if you just happen to rush towards the end, you're going to get destroyed. This is, in its own sense, sort of an RPG. The whole idea is that while you want to ultimately get through the dungeon as fast as possible, at the same time, you want to spend as much time on every floor as possible. Because every floor contains items, it contains enemies. Basically, it contains all the necessary equipment and tools in order to allow you to survive later dungeons. And if you just run to the end, enemies are going to start overpowering you quickly because you're too low leveled and you're too under equipped. That's sort of where the idea of a dungeon crawling RPG sort of becomes so amazing. Because on one hand, you kind of have to balance whether to stick around for so long just to get experience or to move on. If you stay on one floor long enough, well, eventually you're going to have covered everything and there's not going to be any random items for you to pick up anymore. And it's just going to be random enemies that are chasing you. And the longer you stay, the longer your character is going to get worn down. But at the same time, you don't want to push as fast as possible because, well, you're just going to be underprepared, and that's bad. Another great thing about this game is just the fact that it runs off of insane amounts of risk-reward. Because, like I said, you don't really want to get through the game as fast as possible because you're going to be underprepared. But at the same time, you don't want to stick around for any extended period of time because you're going to get diminishing return. There's only so many tiles you can traverse, and eventually you're going to run out of hidden items to pick up. And you're going to fall into all the traps, taking all the damage, and just putting yourself in a bad spot. And what's worse is this game focuses a lot on resource management. You have to manage your own health, your own equipment, your inventory, because you have limited numbers of spaces and you don't want to waste it all on picking up pointless items, but instead want to constantly diversify what you have in your equipment, because if you don't, you're going to run into a situation where nothing you have is effective and you're going to have your back against the wall. But in addition, the longer you stick around to try and get more stuff, get more experience, get more money so that you can afford better stuff, the more your health drops just by virtue of being worn down by enemies. And what's even more scary? Your characters get hungry. And if they get hungry, they become infinitely less effective at basically everything. You need to keep them fed, but there's only so much space in your pack to hold food. You can get extra items that can sort of act as backpack extensions, but you could drop them, and if you do, well, they could be gone forever. There's just an insane amount of risk versus reward and overall strategy here. There's also managing your teammates, because they take damage, they get hungry as well. They're also there to fight enemies with you. Another thing you're going to have to understand and manage is your movement, because this game, like classic rogue games, exists on a turn-based system. It might not necessarily look like it, but essentially, time stops until you do something. Once you do something, then the enemy gets to do something. Rinse, repeat until you get to the end. And this can actually change how you approach combat, because if there's a space in front of you, and then the enemy's in front of that space, you could take the step forward, but then the enemy can act and attack you. Whereas if you just hack at the empty air with your sword, then the enemy has to move into range with you, and then you get some free damage on them. Which means on the basis level, there's a lot of strategy in terms of just sheer movement. And then there's enemies and items that completely change the rules of gameplay. For example, the first boss I ran into, not only does he attack, but his attack seems to hit 3 squares wide in a horizontal slash. Which means if you're standing next to the hitbox that he's attacking, you're going to get hit. You could run into, say, a bee that could attack from 2 spaces ahead. And if you're using swords, you're completely screwed. You have to basically walk inside its hitbox before you ever get a chance to swing at it. But conversely, there's items that allow you to change the rules of how you attack as well. You can pick up rocks that allow you to throw 3 squares ahead of you. And it's just simple things like that that change the way you approach gameplay. And what's even more insane about that, in terms of movement and stuff, is you have allies that walk behind you, which means they're going to follow your relatively simplistic path through the dungeon. And that means that if you're really picking up on the movement mechanics, you can actually position it so that your enemy's in front of you, and suddenly both your characters are attacking at once, doing double damage. For a game as simple as take turns hitting monsters and trying to get to the bottom of the dungeon, there is an incredible amount of depth to it. Now that said, are there problems? Yes, there are. For one thing, the ally AI is a little bit dumb. You don't seem to be able to really control their own actions, and they like to use items all the time. Now, from what I experienced, they were mostly just using rocks and other dumb things that weren't really super necessary and were just taking up space. So even though they were just using items willy-nilly, it wasn't a super detrimental thing, but I could see it being kind of obnoxious. Another thing I found kind of annoying about this game, in terms of overall mechanics, is the fact that this game, very much as a tribute to the original Super Nintendo game, operates on a grid. Now this isn't necessarily a bad thing or anything, but outside of the dungeons, the game does not operate on a grid whatsoever. There's a very natural 3-dimensional control, there's really nice running system, although the animation for it's a little bit wonky. Once you get into the dungeons, you're confined to this grid, and if you start running, you only run like 3 squares ahead up to like the next intersection and then stop. And then you can go again. Or you run headlong into the enemy and take like 3 turns worth of damage. Seriously, the running in this game is kind of crap, and when it's not being crap, it's being really stop and start. But other than that, it is genuinely tremendous in terms of gameplay. You've got a lot of dungeons, you've got excellent, if very classic dungeon crawling mechanics, you've got great randomization that very rarely ever screws you over. That said, you do run into situations where it feels like your back is very much against the wall and everything is going wrong. But in moments like that, you get the most exhilarating gameplay, just trying to pull your own fat from the fire. And then you run into situations where you're just getting items for days and it's great. So even the RNG isn't all that terrible in this game, it actually works quite well. Basically, it tries to be a classic top-down RPG dungeon crawler, and it does it well, with a surprising amount of depth, even though the initial concept is very simplistic. And because the levels are based off randomly generated designs, you basically have near unlimited levels to play if you really want to sink the time into it, which could make this game ridiculously addictive, especially if you're playing this on the classic purist you die, game over, start again mode. And that sort of hardcore aspect to it that is so inherent to the old school mode is, I think, really part of the core experience. It makes everything all the more exciting. Every decision of what few items you can take with you, all the more crucial. It makes moments where you run into a floor and suddenly it's just a giant monster nest, all the more terrifying. And it makes your victory over those situations all the more satisfying. Now the presentation to Shiren the Wanderer on the Wii is pretty good for the most part, but I am going to start off with a complaint, and that is this game plays in a really bizarre aspect ratio. Like, you're not seeing it here because I'm cropping the footage while I'm recording it, but for whatever reason, it just sticks to this really tiny screen. And I mean, I just played Kirby's Epic Yarn. I can tell you that game didn't do it. I'm pretty sure this is like the only Wii game I've had to experience this with. Like, the screen is actually smaller than the standard Wii menu. I'm not sure if this is just like a weird port of the PSP version or something, or they just didn't understand how aspect ratio works. No shame in that, I've got that problem all over the place, but still, it just comes across as weird. But the actual functional design of the characters and worlds are actually really good. Even though you don't see much of Shiren, once you actually go into the cutscenes, the characters are actually ridiculously detailed. Again, even though you're only seeing them from a top-down perspective most of the time, Like, there was no reason for it, but it is there, and it's great. The enemy designs are really creative. You run into simple things like bugs and like mice, and even they have like their own creative twist to their design. It feels like everything here has a personality. And of course, because it's drawing from Japanese mythology, you're gonna see some more classical beasts too. The little thunder god guy and tengus and stuff, they're all here, so there's sort of a nice Japanese flair to it, but it's also very modern and sort of comical in some of their designs. Very full of personality, and I love it. And because there's so many different dungeons, it's actually pretty varied in terms of its actual environmental design too. Which, again, I'm not super familiar with these games. My experience is like games that have a single dungeon that just changes every now and then. That's really impressive comparatively. And audio-wise, it's not bad. I don't think the soundtrack is particularly memorable or anything, but it's excellent. I remember thinking when I first watched the opening intro, wow, this is actually a really impressive soundtrack. So, yeah. Great presentation overall. Now, if you want to get a copy of Shiren the Wanderer on the Wii, lowest one I'm seeing is, oh my god, this game is expensive. Cheapest one I'm seeing, shipping included, is $80. Wow. I guess I'm even more thankful now. I didn't actually pay for my copy. I got it through a trade on the Patreon supporters Discord. So shoutouts to Caleb, the knower of things, for trading me his copy of Shiren the Wanderer for some PS2 thing I had a double of and I didn't really care too much for. This game is, for that price, that is really expensive, and shockingly so, but it is a really fun game. The nice thing is, if you want a copy of the DS version, you can get it for like $25, but that's still pretty costly. Oh hey, I was wrong. There were actually 4 games we got, because there's apparently one on the Vita. The nice thing is, if you don't mind a bit of a language barrier, you could always go out and get like the Game Boy one, or the other Game Boy one, or the other Game Boy one, or the Super Nintendo one, or the N64 one. Although you gotta mod your stuff to be region free in some cases. The point is, if you don't mind getting Japanese, you can get Shiren the Wanderer, or at least earlier iterations for it, for pretty inexpensive. And like I said, you could also theoretically get like the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, which were spin-offs of this, with a bit of a Pokemon flair. So that's another option. But I gotta say, Shiren the Wanderer on the Wii, pretty damn good game. And honestly, before this was traded to me, this was my most wanted Wii game. I'd never seen a copy before, and it looked so fun. And honestly, I'm not super into these games, and of course, because of the overall depth of this game, I'm not all that far in, but you know, I am absolutely hooked on this game, and I think I'm going to be playing this for a long time just in my spare time. Shiren the Wanderer is a really fun little dungeon crawler, and if you can find an affordable copy, you should absolutely grab it, hands down. Because as the Japanese Super Nintendo version once said, it's a game you can play thousands of different times, and it will never be quite the same game.